Hi, my name's Kathy Millett, and this week we're looking at how to do a demolished building interior. There's loads of pictures of demolished buildings around, and you can easily see how buildings were made. What's important is to find a photo that inspires you that's got the same building style. So a lot of these photos are of buildings that are concrete, where the building that I'm doing now, a Kino diorama, is actually brick. So just need to make sure it looks right, because this was built before the age of reinforced concrete. So this is my Kino diorama. It seems ages since I last did it. It was actually last year because I've been on holiday for most of this one. So mid-Feb back into it, and I want to put an interior in. This is a cinema, so I've been thinking very carefully about whether I do a double height ceiling or a lower one, and I've decided that I'm going to do just normal height ceilings in this so that I can get a nice corner where it's not quite as demolished, and I can get a little bit of ceiling and a little bit of floorboard in, so it looks just that little bit more interesting than just a plain couple of channeled out bits. So I've been looking on the internet at pictures. Google has loads of pictures if you put in demolished or burnt or blitz or anything like that for buildings. Unfortunately, there are far too many in this world still, but what they show on brick buildings is there's little pockets for them to put the, I'm going to guess they're rafters or whatever you call the bit that joists that the floor sits on. So they have little holes in here, and then there's a little bit of plaster built out from that where they've obviously plastered the interior. So that's what I'm going to try and replicate. Now, before I do that, a couple of points. One, I've got this on a plastic bag, which might seem a bit weird, but it doesn't have any friction. So when you rub it, you're hopefully not going to rub the paint off the front. Because what I found on some of these corners, that the paint's been rubbing off. You know, plaster, it's been primed well, but it's had a lot of paint, a lot of different techniques on it. And, you know, I did pull a whole section off here with masking tape. So a little bit worried about too much rubbing. Plastic bag will help. It's great for loco shells going into little cases or anything. So I've decided not to glue these together yet, because it'll be easier to work on them flat. But it does mean I just need to probably glue them together before I finish the interior, when I've got to the painted section. So what are we going to do? Well, first of all, I'm going to put in two sections going across like this and round on this one for where the floors would have been. So I've been thinking about the heights, and I want them to be, this is cinema, so it would be a little bit higher. So I'm probably going to go with a 3-inch bottom floor. So I marked out the 3 inches on the back, and then I thought about my joist actual size, and I've got some 5mm by 2mm wood, which I found, which is actually the largest scale number that I have, and I marked out the spacing for that as well. After some debate, I decided on 15mm centres, which is roughly about 18 inches in the scale. So having marked out my 2mm by 5mm holes, I scraped them out with an X-Acto knife in one direction then another, so that I ended up with fairly square holes. Not too deep, not necessarily needed, because I'm going to paint them black, which will give the illusion of depth. And then I did a really rough mock-up of just scratching away for some bricks, just to give some idea that there's something there other than just a smooth surface. And it will be set back in by the next step that we do. So what I'm going to do is make sure I spend the time on just putting a little bit of dented plaster on the rest of this. And it's almost got the texture I want. So what I'm going to do is mix some Polyfilla up. Now, Polyfilla is just interior patching plaster in the UK, and it's really, really common and easy to use. And I'm going to use it because I can flake it off as well, and I quite like it as a texture. So I'm going to go and get some of that and mix it with water. So what I need for my Polyfilla is a little bit of water, Polyfilla, and a spoon or a mixing knife. It comes out and it's just a fine white powder, and I don't need a lot for this. So, and then just a little bit of water so you get a nice paste. So what I tend to do is just mix it until I've got a consistency that I like, and the consistency is one that you can spread. It's quite lumpy, this Polyfilla. I suspect it's been dampened on my shelf for a while, but you want it so it becomes nice and smooth. So what I'm looking to do is just make it look like there's been a little bit of extra on here that's maybe just come away in places. So for that, I'm just going to put a nice fine smooth coat on. I decided I wanted the underneath of the ceiling areas to be much more defined than the above bit. So I put a bit of masking tape on and then pulled it straight off while the plaster was still wet, just to get a nice neat edge for those. I'm less worried about the bit just above the floor because that's the bit I'm going to be flaking off. And whilst it doesn't show here, I did remember to do the side piece later that night. So it's set up overnight and I had a bit of a play this morning, and all we really need is a cocktail stick. And what we're looking to do is make this fall off, and actually this is one I was playing with earlier, to look like the plaster's coming slightly off the wall, whereas here it was very flat. Now it's just going to come off, and I'm going to leave some of this quite intact because it's just below the joist level, but the rest of it's all going to get eaten away from the edges, and where I've got lines I can use those to add cracks. Now as you can see, just following these cracks, a cocktail stick just takes it off, but you can rub it then with your finger, and this polyfiller was quite dilute when it went on. It wasn't particularly sort of solid, and it just comes off really easily. That's why I like polyfiller, it's very easy to use for this. And if it's just a bit too much, you can just literally rub it back down, sand it back down till it goes flat. Okay, so here we are. Basically, the thicker and more solid you make the polyfiller, the more it will flake and the less it will powder off. I quite like it quite powdery, so I did make this quite a watery, thin butter-on mix. It's up to you what you really like. So I'm just going to go and tidy up all the powder and then we'll paint them. So I'm painting mostly just to fix the plaster. It's quite powdery and it's coming off. So I put on 2 coats. First of all, I put on a red-brown, which went onto the brick area, just as a base coat, into all of those little white nooks and crannies, maybe a little bit thinner than thick, because you want it to flow in. Then I put together basically 5 drops of yellow and 1 drop of red-brown, because I wanted a golden yellow and I didn't really have one, and I like Tamiya because it's a nice thick paint. And I watered it down and I used that as a first coat just to go on and mop up a lot of the powder. And when you do this, you end up with quite a lot of powder which you need to rub off before you put the next coat on. And then I put a full strength 5 drops yellow to 1 drop red-brown on. And that gave me a nice stable plaster coat for the next step. So that's sort of stabilised everything and it's now soaked in and it's all dry. So now I need to do the effects, which are going to be the plaster. So what I want is this is dark sand, Vallejo 123 or 70847. And what I want to do is just use this to show the outer bits of the interior. And the yellow and all the raised surfaces is the actual colour that it would be painted. And then I can put some red around for bricks where I haven't got plaster. This is the time to let your artistic nature run wild, or if you don't particularly feel artistic, then just trace around the plasterwork, which is already chipped and plastered and moved away. Just go around the flat bits with the paler colour and leave the bumpier bits as the yellow. And effectively that's all I've done here. And you end up with 2 tones of plaster, the original underneath plaster and then the finish yellow paint layer on top. And I put a few cracks in as well, just for a bit of variety and excitement. So the final thing I painted was just the strips of the brick. And I did that with 2 parts flat red to 1 part red brown, just enough to colour them. And your eye, and there's going to be loads of debris in the way, so it doesn't have to be too exact. So the next thing I need to do is put some kind of weathering on it. It all looks a bit stark and I want some of the little imperfections to show up, and the best way to do that is a wash. Now I could use a dark wash, but I think it might be a bit too dark, so I'm going to use a neutral wash. Anything in the kind of browny beigey type colour is what you want. Now I'm going to use a Mig Neutral Wash. They're not in existence anymore, but there's plenty of other makes that do the Make It Interactive Ammo by Mig, and I just like this one because it's my favourite colour and I tend to use it on everything. Now you do need to consider while you're doing this just how old is your demolished building. If it's a brand new demolished building, then everything's going to be pristine still, and that's what you often see in photos because they're buildings that are newly demolished. If it's been around a while, it's been weathered, you'll get a very different set of modelling. And you just need to think about your own particular model. So with the help of a hairdryer, this is nearly dry. And I've got some dark wash. There are plenty again, panel lines, all sorts of washes you can use. And I've shown them in many other videos. So what you want to do with this is be actually quite sparing. Be sparing with dark wash, a little goes a long way. And the main reason I've got it out is I've done some of the deeper cracks and a little bit will flow along, and if it's too much you can take it back off with a cotton bud. But actually I wanted it for the holes where the joists are going, so they look nice and dark. So I used a bit of the sludgy bit on the cap as well to make sure it looked well dark. And the next thing I need to do is actually just paint my inside of my tiles. And this is on this sort of, we've seen this before as a cobbled street. This looks very boring and it looks like the pavement because I just use the same techniques. So I'm going to put some glazes of colour over the top to go patchwork, black and white. So what I need is a black grey, because I never use entirely one black, sort of Mars black or any of those plain blacks. I don't like it too much. And then I need to just dilute it down quite a bit so I get the glaze. So I've got some water and I've got a brush. So keeping it nice and thin, because I've got patterns and stuff underneath. I don't want it to be too, I don't want to obliterate all the sort of cracks and everything that's under there. So how does that look? Yeah, nice and thin. And unfortunately, I've still got all these things just in the way. So here we go. So I'm going to start at this end and just colour in some black. People ask me why I don't airbrush more, and I could airbrush this. The reason I don't is partly because I've found that the masking tape I'd need to use has been pulling the plaster and the paint apart, because plaster's a very crumbly surface and it just pulls it off just below the surface. So the top bit of plaster is nicely attached, the bit below just isn't. So I'm not entirely keen on the idea of pulling off all what I've done so far. For the pale tiles I decided to use dark sand. So next up, we're gluing the walls together. Now, I've been looking at them, and it's always good to test fit quite a few times. And unfortunately, I guess, yeah, over time, you know, you do work on them, and they're not as even as when I first had them. So you can see there's a little bit of a dip there. So I now end up with a gap, which isn't great. So what I'm going to do is just do a bit of sanding, effectively. So that will be about there. I need that to go there. And I need to just repaint the inside edge, because there's sections where the inside colour's coming through. So what I'm going to do is just, with a knife, because it's very fine, draw the very inside where I need this to go. And then I'm going to have to touch up a few things, I think. So, you can see some of that Polyfilla just needs to come off, and I probably should have done this earlier. So there we go. And the easiest way will be just to get a emery board So what I'm going to do is actually fill it when it's glued, but now at least they can fit as flush as possible. We're now on to the gluing. I can't put it off anymore. I really hate gluing things like this together. It's a bit of a pet peeve. So first up, I have spent a bit of time working out where they sit on this, so I know that they line up with the, so that it all fits with that there, and then this inside edge has to meet up with this one here. There we go. So I'll fiddle with that one, and what I'll do is I'll glue this one first and then fiddle with that one whilst this one's setting. So there's a little bit of movements backwards and forwards, so I need to make sure that I get it not only vertical but that this one then lines up. So let me just put those there. So what glue am I going to use? Well, I'm going to use epoxy. I'm not going to mix that much up at a time, but I need enough that I can do the bottom and the sides of all of these. Now, this is 4-minute epoxy. I've had it a while. It's Deluxe Materials. I'm hoping it's going to set properly. And I just mix it on a card, equal squirts on the card with a cocktail stick. Equal sized piece of each. It's a 1-to-1 mix, this particular brand. And you do need to check, sometimes the mixes aren't equal. And then this is the hardener. Make sure that this, which comes out a lot easier, is about the same amount of size. Let that dry and see if it comes to a similar shape. Okay. It's a bit thicker. Okay, and then it's just a case of mixing them. Now you have to mix them incredibly well. Do not stint, even though it's 4 minutes on this, or you will not get anything to stick. And it is better to glue and then remix some more paint than it is, glue even, than it is to let this go hard and carry on trying to use it when it's a bit too sticky. So this whole thing is about getting it mixed. Make sure you get all of it in, all sort of whatever, and well swirled around, and then, you know. And then mix it from both sides so you get it all in. Oops. And then try and just put it back into the middle in a usable pile. Okay, so now you need plenty of these to keep everything upright whilst you're using your hands for other things. You never have enough hands when you're doing this, and don't put too much on. You don't want it to squeeze out, so I'm just going to carefully put a little bit along there. Now I want it to be right from the beginning, so I'm just going to put one end in and get it just where I want it, and then put the other end down. I don't want to smear glue. If you get it wrong on this one, it's not going to kill you. Oops. And the reason for that is, I'm about to put loads of debris down. So don't panic and think. You can always hide it with a little bush if you get a glue splot on. There we go. So I've now got that with a couple of weights just behind here propping it up. And this is where it gets fun, because now I've got to do the other side. So now I'm not putting a lot of glue on. I'm letting it sort of squeeze itself out a bit. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't want it to ooze out. The other reason is that, well, I don't want it to ooze out is the main reason. This is the time for a lot of faffing around with walls. There's a couple of key points to remember. One, your sides and your walls that have glue on shouldn't really be moved that much, because you might end up smearing glue places, and yes, you can hide it with a debris later, but it won't look as good. Two, you need the angle between the walls to be square, both upright and between them. So I use these set squares, and they're just modelling set squares that I bought over the years. One flat on its side inside to make sure I've got a square corner, and the rest of them leaning up against the wall to make sure it's square vertically. Now it's not that easy on the outside of this wall because there's mouldings, so I make sure that it's definitely square on the inside where it's easier to put the squares on. It's been about an hour, but actually, I mean, this was solid after half an hour, so that's great, nice and solid. If you're using old epoxy, do test it first in case it doesn't set with age. So here we go, I've got this and I've got that hideous gap up the middle, so I just need to go and fill that with, and I'm going to use Deluxe Materials acrylic putty because it's very easy to use. Perfect Plastic Putty by Deluxe Materials. Great plastic putty. Straight out the tube, I won't need that much. And I'm going to use a cocktail stick, and I'm literally going to just smooth it on into the gap. So after I've done an inch or so with the cocktail stick, I then get out a brush and I wet it with quite a bit of water, and I use it to clean off the wall and actually to smooth down the putty in the crack. Now it's worth saying these walls have been painted and enamel treated, but they haven't yet had any pastels or anything like that on, so they're very easy to clean and I don't disturb the finish at all. And you can also use a cotton bud to really get a nice clean, or a bit of kitchen towel. So I really like this putty for that reason. It's very, very easy to use and to clean off when you use too much of it, you get it in places. And I then went and did the outside. I might normally put a gutter pipe on or something, but this is a derelict building and I couldn't help but think the gutter pipe, drain pipe would have fallen off. So I decided just to fill it with a bit of putty. More painting. Well, there's always a lot of painting in these kinds of things, so I'm going to paint the inside. Thankfully, I can remember all the colours, and if I can't, I did a video of them. Now, I know I'm not the most organised person, but actually remembering your colour mixes is really important if you're going to do touch-up. So this was very simple. I went back and repainted all the edges, and then I did the outside with a bit of a stony, I think it was actually a desert stand. And then I went all over them again with enamel washes, just to bed everything down and to set it all up. So this is the final result. It's quite garish because it's a cinema, and it would normally be quite dark in there. But I am going to add a lot of dust in a later week, so it will tone down quite a bit. But I'm pleased. It's got peeling paint, peeling everything really, and it's all come together quite well. So quite pleased how it's turned out.